This is the On Humans podcast, a show about how new research in the sciences and humanities can help us better understand ourselves and each other. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today's episode is about one of the most essential distinctions that we tend to make in navigating through the world, the distinction between men and women, grounded, of course, originally in the biological distinction between males and females. So, how useful is that binary distinction? We all know that binary thinking is not exactly in fashion. Ideas about spectrum, diversity, fluidity, much more so. But what about biological sex? It just seems that the idea of male and female are essential in biology. I know this personally. I taught biology. I wanted to be sensitive to issues around gender. At the same time, I've drawn those arrows from anthers to ovaries in flowers. I've used the terms dad cell and mother cell while doing so. And I really don't know how I could have done it any differently without losing the children's attention. And maybe that's just fine. Sex cells, gametes, in humans are binary, sperm and egg. Same with flowers. But here's the twist. Humans aren't sex cells. We humans are animals made of trillions of cells, and as animals we are not so easily grouped. XY chromosomes don't always produce a penis, and when we turn to hormones, brains, and behaviours, the picture gets even messier. Or so argues Augustín Fuentes, a Princeton professor of biological anthropology, and really one of the giants of the field today. I wanted to have him on the show for ages, just didn't have the right excuse, until his new book, Sex is a Spectrum, was coming out. I was sent it a couple of months ago with a request to interview for the show, and well, I was delighted to get that message, and here we are. We had a great conversation. We talked about everything from hermaphroditic worms to sex-changing fish, and from gender stereotypes around parenting to intersex humans in sports and out of sports. If you have thoughts about Fuentes' argument or the concerns that I raise, you can always head to onlyhumans.substack.com to the episode page. You can find it in the show notes also, where you can leave your comments and be part of the conversation. Also, if you're new to the show and enjoy this, welcome. Hit the subscribe button, join the journey. If you listened to the show before and you like it and want to show some support, very easy thing to do is to just leave 5-star review in whatever app you're using if you think I deserve that. And share it with a friend if you think that they would enjoy this. And finally, just want to say a warm thank you, as always, to all the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. It really warms my heart. And as always, this episode is for you. So let's get started with the author of Sex is a Spectrum, published this week, and Princeton University professor, Augustín Fuentes. Professor Augustín Fuentes, welcome to On Humans.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
And congrats on your new book. Sex is a Spectrum is the title of the book. And we'll get to that soon. One of your major books before this one was called The Creative Spark. Why don't you give a kind of quick story? What was the story really? Why did you want to write that? What was there something that you felt wasn't quite right? There was a hole to be filled. And maybe that can also help us kind of approach the story of what led you into the current work.
Yeah, that was sort of the culmination of a couple decades of my research and training and work. I'm really interested in sort of why humans are the way we are. I love animals. I love plants. I was always really interested in the relations between things and how stuff works, like what makes things tick. And so as I went through my college career, I found out you could actually study these complex sets of relations and dynamics. And so I always started from there rather than thinking of like, I'm really interested in genes, or I'm really interested in, reproduction, or I'm really interested in diets. I always was wondering, how do these things relate to one another? And I realized that there wasn't much good synthesis out there that wasn't either very reductive, right? Sort of the Dawkins version, or very superficial, let's say some of the stuff that here I get into trouble, but some of Steven Pinker's overview of the way in which humans are. And then there was like Jared Diamond's sort of overview of like, these ecological determinism. And I thought, look, all of these have aspects that are absolutely correct and really interesting, but they're missing the kind of relations, the connections across all these different things, and also drawing on diverse fields: anthropology, psychology, history, evolutionary biology, geography, like putting these psychology, cognitive science. Is there a way to put this stuff together for a broad audience? Because I figure we have all of this information in journals and research studies in the academy, but only little teeny bits of it seep out from the academy. And usually they seep out in a very, very specific, like, this is the right way, or it's this way. And so I was trying to do the big overview type of thing that draws on all those different things together because I was just frustrated that that wasn't available. So I put it out there. Unfortunately, about 4 months before my book came out, Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, came out.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's an attempt to do the same thing, but no, Harari, is a wonderful writer. He writes amazingly well, but his understanding of human evolution is not very good.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's also not very extensively covered. I mean, Sapiens starts pretty much 70,000 years ago, so that's yesterday, the big picture.
It doesn't do the job, but oh my God, is it well written? And it also makes sense to people because it speaks to what they already believe. And I think that so. Mine did very well, but not as well as it would have done had Sapiens not come out. So, I'm still in that, even this book that we're going to be talking about today, it's still in this idea that, look, we have all of this knowledge, all of this academic research and knowledge, but so little of it sort of escapes the ivory tower in ways that are complex, relational, and accessible. And I think that's my goal as I move on in my career, is to try to facilitate more of that better discussion in the broader public.
You mentioned something about Sapiens, which I think might be really the key to understanding where you come from. You said it speaks to what people already believe. What do you think people believe that you wanted to challenge?
I mean, in that original book, and we'll talk a lot about in this book, is that there's very simple understandings, linear notions of what it means to be human, right? Humans are this way because of these three things, or humans are this way because of this thing. And that there's sort of a progressive evolution of this, then this, then this, and that tells us everything. There are elements of truth in what I just laid out, but it's much more complicated. And so, in the previous book was like, well, humans are, aggressive and destroy the environment because of this reason. And humans have this kind of commitment to market economies and behavior because of this reason. Humans and technology have this relationship because of this reason. It's like anyone who tells you there's one explanation for why humans are the way they are is wrong. They're just lying to you. And so it's funny, though, because I got a lot of criticism. That book is called The Creative Spark, How Imagination Made Humans Distinctive. And I'm not arguing that imagination is the one thing. I actually have this very complex argument in the book about relations and dynamics and evolutionary processes and cognition and ecological dynamics and all that sort of stuff. But publishers want you to have a catchy title. So, that sort of focused it on the thing. I was good. I mean, my other titles have been catchy. I've Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, Busting Myths About Human Nature. And this one that we're going to talk about, the main title is Sex as a Spectrum, but the real title is The Biological Limits of the Binary. And that's the sort of academic place that I'm coming from, is that, the binary is a traditional way to talk about sex, but in fact, I think it's rather limited.
I think that the creativity, imagination that might be helpful in here, because would it be right to say the kind of impression I would take if someone just asked, like, hey, what is Fuentes like as an anthropologist? I would say that he's someone who tries to take both biology and culture really seriously.
Always.
And in a sense, I guess, if imagination and by the way, my understanding from the book is that it's very much imagination as a collective enterprise.
Exactly.
Together, imagining together. Yeah. Therefore, if that's one of the things that makes us who we are, then that does give a lot of creativity in different life ways, different lifestyles, not just that one true way of being human. Is that right?
Yeah. And so you could argue that in one sense, I'm trying to convince many of my colleagues and the public that culture matters. But on the other hand, I'm also trying to convince many of my colleagues in the public that biology matters.
Yes.
And the problem is like these two camps, culture or biology, which is insane because that's not true. We are biocultural. You can sometimes try to untangle some of the relations between those aspects, but they're always together. And I think that's like, if we could just get that to be the standard assumption or starting point for conversations about all this stuff, I think we'd be in much better shape.
Well, you've come to the right show. That's the attitude. Let's start with the new book. Sex isn't a binary in the biological world would be what you said is kind of the key themes. Let's make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah.
I'll give a kind of really high level take on how I would understand as someone who's not trained in biology, is not trained, but I've read your book, I've read other works that are similar. My kind of general impression would go something like this, that there is a very strong tendency for people to think of, if we hear the word sex or sexuality or sex in the animal kingdom, we think of male and female. But if we look at across animal kingdom, we see many, many cases where this kind of clear binary doesn't actually work. There is a little bit of truth, perhaps, in that. We should probably get into that. There's a certain element of truth in that every time we talk about sexual reproduction, I guess there is always two. We don't have any creatures where you have like three gametes joining one. And I think we want to make sure that we don't like throw that out of the window while we do what's really important and see where the limits is.
Right.
And I think where the limits seem to be is that, yes, in the nuts and bolts, we might see in sexual reproduction, we might see a binary even in cases where the living organism doesn't live up to the standard of there must be clear males, clear females who stay like that for the rest of their lives.
Let me clarify one thing about the binary, right? In an argument against the binary, what humans or any other animals, it's not saying that males and females aren't typical distributions and categories that are useful, right? It's just saying that envisioning them as two distinct versions or forms of that species or organism, that's a binary. And that's a problem and we'll get into this more, but I think that's the problem. Clearly gametes are binary, right? Anisogamy by definition has to be binary, right? Two different kinds of gametes. But pretty much everything else about reproductive systems are not exactly binary. And so that's my argument, is that seeing males and females as binary rather than as clusters of typical development behavior patterns and things like that. So we can get back to that.
That's good. And and the reason and by the way, let's leave the fungi, the mushrooms, the plants aside.
Fungi are great, but that's crazy.
They're weird. But I do think that it's worth reminding that they do exist in a sense that also it's easy to imagine that the story is so at first you have basically cells cloning themselves and then suddenly you have the invention of sexuality, which means that you start having female organisms and male organisms. And actually talk to the fungi, they have a different view on this. But focusing on animals, even within animal kingdom, we find some really, really mind-bending things. And we will talk about humans for sure. But I think that it would be fun to ground this with some funky animal facts, because while we might be sometimes weird in this way, their animals were much, much weirder.
So this is really great. So what's really interesting is that we have to step back, and when you look at and survey the whole range, you have to say, wait a minute, maybe it's not that there's a lot of weird creatures out there. It's just that there's a lot of ways to do sex biology successfully. So a couple of my favorites, right? I talk in the book about a few, but fish, oh my God. Well, this is the blue-headed wrasse or a variety of different kinds of gobies. And this is why I think binary thinking is limited, because, for example, the same individual with the same set of DNA, one body, one set of DNA, can be fully reproductively female and male during its lifetime at different times, and might even switch back and forth dependent on ecological, social, or other conditions. And that right there, I'm like, how does the saying males and females are two different kinds of things help us when the same set of genes, the same body, all the same tissues can manifest as both of the sexes throughout their life in different stages or back and forth? That I think that's fascinating. And I don't think they're the same organ, like exactly the same when they're doing reproductive biology as a female or as a male. But the fact that the same individual does it means that maybe binary thinking is not the best way to frame this.
What was the fish that changes where they only have, was it one male in the group, and when the male dies, the biggest female just flips and becomes a male?
There's a couple gobies that do that. The bluehead wrasse is a good example, but there's a number of these different kind of they're mostly smaller fish that live socially, highly socially, right? And so the biggest individual is, usually the male. Well, actually that flips in some others, it's the female, but let's say the biggest is the male and a bunch of smaller ones. And when that individual dies or is forced out, the next largest individual there's social, right, cues that catalyze physiological, endocrinological processes that convert basically the female reproductive tissue into male reproductive tissue, right? But in some species, if another big male migrates, if another big fish who happens to be a male migrates into the group, that switches back. It's really amazing, but it clearly is not a binary system. And so that's interesting. So the fish are great. Earthworms are also fantastic, just because earthworms contain a full set of sort of sperm producing and a full set of eggs producing physiology in their bodies simultaneously.
Yeah, and these are the worms that everyone's familiar with on a rainy day that crawl out.
Exactly. And so next time you see one, be in awe because they are fully intersex, right? That have both fully functioning reproductive tracts. And then they can choose to either meet up with another worm and sort of do the handoff, the exchange of the correct gametes, or just fertilize themselves, right?
What about birds? I think in your book you said something about some birds having basically like 4 different sexes.
So this is a particular sparrow. It's really interesting. And what they have is 4 functional sexes, only 2 gamete-producing types, but 4, like 2 kinds of males, 2 kinds of females. So 2 different kinds of these birds produce sperm, 2 different kinds produce eggs, but they can't all 4 mix with each other. So they have physiology and markings and behavior that means there's actually 4 possible sex modes, right? So a couple kinds of male, a couple kinds of female, and that they can only mate with the right other kind. And so that's really interesting. The other thing with birds is sometimes females are really big and males small. Sometimes males are really big and females small. About 80% of all birds have communal care. That is, that both the male and the female help in caring for the young, basically with a safe base.
Oh yeah, and I'd love to actually go to that that other question of not whether we have a clear male and female, but what does it entail behaviorally. Before that, I just wanted to point out one thing, which is, I think, very much to your point about there is a case to be made that these shouldn't be treated as the quote weird, my word, exceptions, but as something that's just part and parcel of the animal world. Is that I chuckled when I was reading through the book and I noticed that C. elegans, the famous model organism, this is I'm not a biologist, so I can't give the proper introduction to who is C. elegans, but C. elegans is the animal that is used as the textbook model for how the nervous system works, whatever, because it's so simple, we understand it so well. And they don't have males and females in the same sense as one would expect, right?
Right. So they have intersex and I just forgot. Intersex and male. And they are, as you said, this is the go-to for basically all intro biology, right? This is how we learn about things.
Yeah, this is the animal.
Of course, they also, regenerate. We chop them up into pieces and they regenerate most of their. So weird, actually, I think is the standard for much of the world, animal world. And I think we need to reframe how we think about that. Or I would just say diverse. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think let's move on then. I think there's a couple of pushbacks that could be said about this. One is that, well, these are cool examples, but there are numerically still a small minority. Another one would be that these are cool examples, but it's irrelevant to humans. Let's take those one by one.
Yeah.
Do you have any numbers to put on this sense of like how common is to find these species that we can have this funky conversation on, where you don't have the overwhelming majority of the individuals being very clearly female or male?
I think so. It's probably a minority of all animal species. The problem is most people assume clear binary distinctions. And so what you've seen over especially the last 5 years, is a number of animal biologists revising sort of what is considered typical patterns and processes. There's been a number of publications that have challenged, wait a minute, can we actually talk about this organism in this clear binary mode, or do we have to think more about distribution of traits or sort of the range of typical phenotypes or what bodies and behavior? And so that first pushback, I think it's valid, but in a general sense, I'm not happy with being able to explain 70% of the variation and ignoring 30%, right? Or even 20%. So that's a larger debate, but I think that's a good one, right? We're like, how do we frame these? How do we understand this? And this is, as I say in the book, look, there's plenty of animals that fit in like, okay, this is pretty clearly male and female seem to be really different in how they behave, and their bodies have incredibly different demarcations. That's absolutely. Now, extreme differences like anglerfish, right? Where you got the giant female and this little teeny male, that's pretty rare in the animal kingdom. Insects are weird. They have a horror set, but things with backbones, and especially mammals, we just don't see radical differences. But the second one, I think, is the more important one. People always say, well, fine. So, clownfish, right? The little Finding Nemo fish, right? That they switch sexes. And people are like, what does that have to do with humans? And the point is that humans are biological organisms. We're related to, the panoply of life. And so understanding biological diversity processes and patterns as a baseline allows comparative context for humans. So good biology is a baseline that we've got to start from to talk about humans. Not that humans are fish at all, but we have to understand what is sex biology in the animal kingdom to then ask the question, what is sex biology for humans?
Let's start moving towards humans. But I want to take a little detour on the way there, which is that there's really two things that I think that in 2025, many people who see the book title immediately think about gender identity. But there's another question which you hinted at before, which is to the extent that you do find males and females, how categorically different are they? Where obviously, like, we get this typical idea of males being bigger and more aggressive, females being smaller and less aggressive, more caring, etc. Let's do some. Why don't I'll give you a kind of standard hunch, if not a well-developed view, and then you correct me. Let's say care in mammals. Care is overwhelmingly done by females for quite obvious reasons. We're mammals. The whole point is that we lactate and whatnot. There are species where males don't care at all, and then there are species where males help, and there are species in between. But there are no mammals where the males would care more than the females. So now, correct me.
Yeah, no, but I see that's actually a really good thing. I mean, because there's all these assumptions, and that's the problem with. We need data, right? There are species where there's no care by males, and then there's species where there's a lot of care by males. And there's, in fact, a few species, this is actually not uncommon in some groups of primates, where basically at birth, the male takes the infant and does 95% of the carrying and caring for that infant, but the female gives it to the female for breastfeed.
Were these like monkeys in South America? Or
yeah, we see this in especially in Aotus, the owl monkeys. We also see this in titi monkeys and a range of tamarins. And in some of these tamarins, it's really interesting because it's the father, usually the father, and other adults or other young, older siblings that carry. So mom does little carrying, does a lot of the feeding, but mom is dominant over everyone and it's the center of attention. And it's I'm just saying there's these variations. And in other animals, there's been this representation, like, for example, wolves, right? Canids in general, but wolves in specific are fascinating because you have a reproductive pair, but then you have all the males and females in the group, in the pack, actually contributing extensively, frequently, to care of the pups. Right. So the one female, sometimes two females will nurse them, but multiple individuals care for them. And the more we understand and actually look at this in social mammals, highly social mammals, the more we see complex processes of care where both males and females are involved. But of course, being mammals, lactation is a central thing, right? So gestation, lactation. So female mammals are always at the center of reproduction and care, but there's a huge diversity of systems around how that works. Now, this is in social mammals. And some of the mammals that spend very little time together, we see much more focus on females as the primary or even only caretakers. And then this is the story when we get to humans, right? This is a very interesting context.
Let's do humans, because here's another myth for you to bust. Another myth would be, okay, cool, we have these titi monkeys, we have, whatever, wolves, cool. But look at the close relatives of humans. Look at chimpanzees. The mothers are completely, they're lone heroes who don't let others touch the infants. Even the wonderful, all loving bonobos, like, they are very, very much not a titi monkey situation where the males would be caring a lot. And so all of this titi monkey stuff, this is completely irrelevant to humans. So let's go.
The apes are, I think, really, really interesting. And we are quite distinct from the apes in many ways. And this is something that emerged on the hominin lineage. And I think something that's really important and characteristic probably of more hominids than just us, genus Homo, right? But even before Homo sapiens is around, there's a radical change in developmental dynamics and the trajectory of growth of children. And that change in growth patterns, this incredibly long infancy and juvenile period where humans, we're weird, right? A giraffe is born and in, 25 minutes it's running along, right? Humans are born and it's 5 years before we can even run so we have this incredible system, and that system, and now many scholars have argued this. Hari's a good example. A number of folks have done very good work to illustrate that humans are cooperative caretakers.
But it genuinely takes a village.
It generally does.
Which by the way, is what we discussed. Just recently published an episode with Chris Stringer, and one of the things that I asked him about, and he was, we didn't talk about this very long, but I think it's just to highlight is this really interesting point about humans is not only that we are so helpless for so long, but chimps have a new kid every 7 years. If you like, my older sister is 4 years older than me, and that's actually quite old for like many of my friends are like 2 years difference between siblings. So humans weirdly did this crazy equation work where we have much more helpless children and we have them much more often.
Yeah. But what's important here, what people don't usually mention is when we talk about male and female differences, we're usually assuming, look, male and female differences happen because females and males are under totally different stresses because of reproduction, right? And the thing is with humans, it's very, very clear that fairly early on in our development, we evolved a different response such that the energetic costs of gestation, lactation, carrying, and caring for infants is spread across group members, not solely on the female, right? And so to say that women are locked into caretaking and men are locked into hunting, that just ignores the data. That's a binary perspective, and it's just wrong. That's not to say men and women are the same at all, but it is, there are males and females, but it is to say that, look, we need to look at lineages specifically, just like we need to talk about gobies and not goldfish, right? They're actually very different in their reproductive dynamics. We need to talk about humans in deep time to figure out how do we explain the contemporary human bodies and behaviors. And when we do that, we're like, wait a minute, this stark division around reproduction between males and females is not as stark or as clear as we thought.
Yeah, and one thing to say in favor of that, and then one thing to push back in favor of that. I also think that whatever you have literally the term monogamy on the title of one of your myth busting books. So I know that you don't believe that humans evolved to be monogamous, that everything else is somehow unnatural to us. However, it seems pretty clear that we evolved pretty strong inclinations towards what biologists call pair bonding.
Yes.
Or some kind of long-term commitment. And you're the biologist, so correct me, but how common or how much does it make sense to evolve pair bonding if there isn't any care from the paternal side involved? Maybe it happens. For me, it just doesn't make much sense.
It does happen, and that's what's weird about it. So I've done a lot of work on pair bonding and all of this.
But I'm glad I asked you then.
But actually, we have social pair bonds and sort of physiological or reproductive pair bonds. And those two things sometimes overlap and sometimes they don't. But with humans, I think it's very, very clear that pair bonding is an incredibly important part of our evolutionary dynamic and of our physiology, right? Our endocrine systems, our behavioral systems. Humans pair bond. But they don't just pair bond around heterosexual reproductive pairs. We actually use this in a bunch of different ways. And part of this probably emerges from our incredible interreliance on one another, not just around parenting and caring, but actually foraging and protecting. And so I think it's the explanation is at a higher order of group cooperative interactions. And so it's not just about the sort of heterosexual thing. So monogamy is not like monogamy happens. Clearly, it's quite common, but it is not synonymous with pair bond. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's the key distinction that a lot of people miss. But hey, I promised one pushback. The pushback would be that, I've had Sarah Hardy on the show. I know this literature pretty well. Dads actually don't get that much credit often in the cooperative breeding literature. It's even sometimes, I think probably falsely, but there is even this way of positing cooperative breeding where it's mostly, grandmothers, big sisters, aunties doing it as an alternative to the more traditional pair bonding. It's the dads giving that support. Clearly the moms need support from somewhere. And actually the whole cooperative breeding literature is actually not very male friendly. Hardy's recent book is called Father Time. It's a wonderful book. It's a really lovely book.
It's an amazing book, yeah.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. And I hope she's listening to this. Hi, Sarah, if you are. I know she does follow the show. But she has a very nuanced argument.
Right.
I really hope I'm not butchering it now, but basically what she's saying is that human fathers did, contrary to some kind of very binary views, fathers did evolve to be capable of developing the same kind of care systems. And you see this, like the brain circuits literally start rewiring if fathers spend time with children. However, she also is quite firmly saying that actually the level of care that you see in 21st century is actually really, really unique. And it's not something that you see in human ancestors, that this is genuinely novel. And so, I don't know how much does it complicate what you said. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think, first of all, everyone should read the book. I think it's fantastic. And they should also read, there's a diversity of scholars doing this work. Sarah Erdely's book is absolutely spectacular. I think summarizes a lot of this. I would really recommend folks read Lee Gettler's work, which is also really amazing to think about his model for dads and sort of thinking about psychoneuroendocrine dynamics of men, males, and their response to caretaking. It's like the data are very clear. For humans, it's not just female bodies that respond to infants. All human bodies respond to infants in a very robust caretaking, facilitating a physiology of care. You got to be with that infant and be around to get those changes. I mean, the bottom line is, and Sarah and I might disagree something on the timing of this, but clearly to restrict care to only females and female relatives is not matched in the physiological or archaeological or evolutionary records. The challenge is there's such a strong pattern of isolating females in a lot of contemporary, let's say, developed sort of economically robust sort of capitalist societies that it's hard for us to see beyond like what we're seeing now. And so,
hold on, I think that's where she probably would push back. I mean, she would say that, I mean, just looking at, you're an anthropologist.
Right.
If you look at cross-culturally, it's certainly not something that like female care emerges out of the womb of capitalism.
Yeah. No. I think solitary female care. And this is a whole other conversation because we need to sort of, how do we envision the archaeology of caretaking?
No, but literate societies, if we focus on literate societies, it doesn't, I mean, the arrow seems to be towards more male care, not less during the past 100, 200 years.
Well, it depends. I think there is more male care of a particular kind, but I think it's recapturing that capacity. So I think there was substantially more group and probably male care in deep time.
In deep time, for sure. Yeah. But thinking about the last, 5,000 years or something.
Exactly. I think really the last 8 to sort of the onset of particular agricultural and structural patterns in societies.
There I'm with you. Yeah. It was, agriculture, Neolithic stuff, for sure. Yeah. Modern last couple of 100 years, 100-year capitalism. That's what I wanted to push back on.
No, this is the great dynamic, is that this stuff always goes, the simple linear story of progressive evolution, it just doesn't hold. So anyway.
Yeah, hey, this was wonderful. But we do have to get to the other hot button issue, which is the gender identity and its relationship with biological sex. But before we do, I just want to, there was the line in your book that most made me want to be like, wait, what? This is cool. I need to ask him about this. It has to do with this kind of male-female differences in humans. And the line is, quote, "Humans have the strongest similarity between females and males in number of offspring produced of almost any mammal." So, yeah, elaborate, explain, please. This I was fascinated by this line, but I wasn't like, I'm not sure if I understand what's going on.
Yeah, so these data are really interesting. So there's a bunch, they're hard to get effectively, right? But what we really, one of the big arguments in sexual selection, or like the different kinds of pressures on males and females, is reproductive variance, right? How much variation is there between males and females, or between males or between females in a given species? And that should tell us something about the kinds of evolutionary pressures on them, because this variation, the sort of level of variance in reproductive output, should reflect different strategies or different kinds of contexts. And so there are many who have argued that, human males have tons of offspring and human females have very little offspring. When you actually look at the data across populations and across time, certain very few individual males can be documented as having lots of offspring.
Yeah, the Genghis Khans or whatever.
Yeah. But that's 1 in a gazillion. That's very rare. And so what we see is that actual reproductive variance, even between males in most societies, now there's some variance in some societies that is marked, but if you average across all of the data sets available between males and also between males and females, we see that the differences are in fact minimal. Many other animals, you see much more variance between males and females, or and it goes in both directions. So what's really interesting, and another sort of what I would argue a large data point in support of this complexity in human reproductive dynamics, is that our actual reproductive variance, what they call reproductive skew between males and females, is very low compared to most mammals.
Interesting.
So we have to sort of think, what does that mean about sort of, place the last 2-3 million years of human evolution, and how do we get to a system like that? However, then you see in the contemporary moment, it is back to Sarah Hrdy's sort of looking at this, where the radical economic structuring and energetic structuring of reproduction has changed so much in the last few centuries that we're seeing different kinds of patterns there as well. So I think that's really interesting.
And also after the Neolithic, there is also the famous Y chromosome bottleneck, where suddenly out of nowhere, a small amount of men start leaving much more Y chromosome DNA. And we are like, wait, what happened? Something happened.
Yeah. And so I think that's what's really interesting. So there's just no good evidence that in the past, in the humans, there were sort of hyper-reproducers, males, and a bunch of males that didn't reproduce. This sort of dominance effect or things like that we just don't see. And so that's something you have to take into account when you model human evolution and when you model sex.
Well, okay, let's then attack the case of binary males and females in humans, not in fish, not in birds, but in humans. Leaving aside questions about gender identity, focusing on the biological sex. I think that the intersex conditions they should be better understood. I don't think that a lot of these terms are not in the public imagination in the same way, like the condition, 5AR2D. It's, for many people, it sounds like a Star Wars robot name that doesn't sound like a, understandable condition. But there's a lot of these really technical terms. Is there a way, can you open up what intersex conditions kind of generally are, maybe give like 3 buckets of how they might manifest, or 4 buckets, or something that can help people who get lost with a lot of acronyms in kind of with a little bit more understanding of, now I understand why even in humans, not everyone is a clear female or a clear male.
No, I think that's really important. But let me even nudge something right before I get to that, because I think that's incredibly important, because people misrepresent what intersex means and how we frame that. But let me just really quickly, part of the sexism spectrum is to sort of push away of thinking of male and female bodies as totally different trajectories or kinds. And so someone's thinking about overlaps and different kinds of things like that. So before we even talk about intersex, let's just talk about things that aren't sexed, right? I think it's really important is if I dumped a liver on the table here in front of you, would it be male or female?
Well, I wouldn't know.
No one would know, right? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, in adult, you could make some guesstimates, but so livers, spleens, hearts, kidneys, lungs, these things aren't sexed in the way that there's a male liver and a female liver. Organ transplants, that's not something that's worried about, right? The one thing I want to stress here is that much of our bodies is not even a dimorphic. It's part of variation. So then the question becomes, well, where are there differences, right? And how do we understand this, right?
Yeah, so the simplest explanation is that, well, it has to do with reproduction. That's the whole point of sex. And therefore, look at the reproductive organs, look at the reproduction-related hormones. And that's where you find those really clear differences.
And even then, those differences aren't as clear as we like to think, right? If we think about genitals, remember, genitals develop from the same tubercles, right? The same tissue masses, right? Because of different stimuli around, which are correlated with the genetic XX or XY, but not 100%, because there's a lot of variation of turning genes on and off and other kinds of developmental dynamics. So genitals form from the same thing. And that's why genitals actually overlap much more than you think in forms of tissue and even sense of forms. We understand, the scientific world understands the development of the uterus to a certain extent. We know which sort of tissues it emerges from and most of what those characteristics are. And that is typical, right, of female bodies, right, or bodies that are XX, or at least bodies that respond as if they were XX. Because you can get the same development in an XY body if certain sets of genes don't turn on and others do.
Oh, hold on a second. With XY bodies, you can get a lot of the features. Can you have a fertile female physiology with an XY chromosome?
Very, very rare, but yes, you can, because you can get none of those Y chromosomes turning on and just the X chromosomes turning on.
Okay, because in athletics, there's often discussion, of people who have like XY chromosomes, but because they are their bodies don't respond to androgens like testosterone. They end up developing like a female, so they have the XY, but a lot of their features are female-like. And typically they are not fertile either way.
Let's talk about intersex, because I think that's sort of stems from all of this. And the basic argument, the basic understanding is that let's just take mammals. In mammals, you have sort of differential patterns of development, right, that canalize variation into male or female structures. What those are in particular varies across mammals, but in humans, we have a good understanding of what those typical developmental trajectories are. In a certain percentage of humans, there is a radical differentiation in that typical distribution of variation and development, such that you get either sort of a split in the gonads or other reproductive components that reflect both contributions of what we would call male and female dynamics, or you get fully functioning, and this is incredibly rare, sets of reproductive organs of both males and females in one body. So that would be what we call the full intersex individual. But intersex actually today reflects all of the different dynamics that show variation overlap between the typical expectations. So for example, the polycystic ovarian syndrome in those individuals that are XX creates dynamics where there's very, very high levels of androgen, testosterone, and a few others produced, which change some of the patterns and processes in development. And that's actually quite common. I mean, they don't really know, but they think it ranges between about 7 to maybe as high as 20% of individuals across the species.
But they're typically not classified as intersex, and they're classified as high androgen woman.
But this is where we have to think, what do we mean by intersex?
Well, you have a great term. Which is 3Gs. And I think this is a great term. I think this is when people want to be like respectful, clear, and talk about someone who is like, I don't know what the term is, but like, clearly like a man. So if someone who has XY has testicles and has, what am I missing?
Testicles, penis.
Yes, testicle, penis, and produces sperm.
No, because the 3Gs don't include gametes. Gametes is not one of the Gs. So it's genes, gonads, and genitals, right? Because the gametic production, gametes are binary, but there isn't a one-to-one corollary with any of the 3G states and production, right? I mean, 3G is really important. So people always ask, well, Augustine, what's your definition of sex if it's not gametes, right? Gametes are not a good definition of sex because, a sperm is not a male and an ova is not a female. And a sperm is definitely not a man and an ova not a woman. So I use the term 3G, borrowing from Daphne Joel and Heather Shattuck-Hydorn and Zachary Dubois. So 3G female is someone who is XX, has a vagina, labia, and uterus, and has ovaries. 3G male is someone who's XY, who has a penis and scrotum and testes. And so those are identifiable sort of typical trajectory patterns, but each one of those Gs actually varies. And that variation, thinking of it that way, allows us to say, okay, well, this person is not a typical 3G, or this person has 2 of the 3Gs. And we can understand variation in bodies as opposed to saying there's 2 kinds. Gonads are not binary, right? Humans do sometimes produce ovotestes, and humans also produce ovaries or testes that don't actually function to produce the gametes, because producing gametes are binary. But in fact, the structures, the physiology, the biology that produces gametes is not, right? It's actually more diverse. And so that's why, and so 3G gives us measurable, biologically based assessments that we can look at with the recognition that they're not fixed categories, but rather distributions of variation that are typical. And then we can then understand the variation there without calling them weird, right? That's part of the range in there. And so that's why I use that. And that's why it's becoming more and more used in people who are really interested in understanding sort of biological variation in bodies. So if you think about typical intersex, which is a strange phrase, but I think that's important. You have this developmental and genetic variation in humans. Typically, the developmental and genetic variation creates what we would say 3G male and 3G female. However, there's a lot of flux in there. How much that flux is hard to know, because most people don't know that they might be part of this intersex diversity, because it doesn't have phenotypic or external manifestations. So there are sort of multiple ways in which you get this. You can have variants on XX and XY. You can have XYY, Y. You can have XXX. You can have a variety of different modifications. You can also have XX or XY. And then that second level is that some of the genes on the X or the Y don't turn on, or they turn on, but they don't produce the correct protein product, or they turn on and produce the protein product, but the receptors are not functioning well. And so you can have that cascade thing, which then has different outcomes that would be called intersex. Then you also have intersex conditions of development where you have the genetics and the actually gene action and protein action doing its thing, right, in a typical sense, but actual developmental dynamics, some of the chemistry and tissue-tissue interaction shit. And so you get different developments in that way. Now, again, none of these things are common, but they're part of the range of developmental variation. And what's really interesting is most of these don't cause debilitating, right, life-threatening outcomes. Some do. And some produce individuals who are incapable of reproduction, but many of these do not. And many of these are so what we would call minor, is that we don't even notice. For example, things like the development of some ovarian tissue in a testes, right? That happens, right? And those are, I think it's just really interesting. Rather than thinking there's weird exceptions, let's think about what's the range of variation. Here are typical threads of variation and what's happening in the spaces in between them. That's why the spectrum approach is really important. And when it comes to health, I think that's really, really important. So, we know, for example, that women die after heart attacks more than men do. All right. But it's not about the structure of the heart. We know that. It's not that there's a male and female heart biology. Something else is going on in lives or in patterns or in body structures or some other things. And if we're just thinking of males and females as two separate kinds of things, then we're asking what's up with the woman heart. That's a problem. It's actually this much more complex thing, which gets to gender and identity and lived experience.
But there is a tension here, right? Which is that in a lot of, of course, if we would have all the money in the world, we would run research with a huge amount of different subgroups. We don't. And for example, in exercise physiology, people complain a lot that a lot of studies are done on male populations. And then they are extrapolated to cover everyone. And there's a huge push to have female samples for the purpose that even if, of course, these are not like every man is alike and every woman is completely different, but even just asking for someone's gender identity gives you so much predictive power. And even if this men-woman difference, male-female difference, even if it's obviously imperfect, it just does give quite a lot of predictive power. And only by saying that it does give you predictive power can you justify having a male sample and a female sample in your exercise physiology study or whatever drug sampling study you have. And I know a lot of women close to me feel quite strongly about the fact that they feel like they are often being missed in this thing because there's something about, their female bodies that they understand with each other and the man in the room, he doesn't understand. And I'm so in favor of that like, how do I at the same time talk about, but all these things are different and you two are also very different from each other. So what do you think of that tension?
I actually agree 100%. And I clearly make the case in the book that understanding the way I'm proposing this actually, I think, argues for more focus on women, on females. And those are not always the same thing. I think that's a really important component.
And by the way, if I can say very briefly, just to link back, I think it's really interesting because we often think of, someone is male, but then transitions to be a woman. But there's also the inverse, which is a lot of intersex people identify very strongly as being, women and men.
Right.
And so I think it's important to remember that the arrow can go that way too.
Exactly.
To link back into the intersex.
No, but I think here's what's really interesting. Look, there is incredible misogynistic bias, discrimination, and abuse of women and the female body in medical research and historically in scientific research. That's well documented. There's no doubt about that. So really, radically increasing the number of those individuals who we identify as female or identify as women in a variety of ways in test samples is absolutely necessary, but it's insufficient, right? I would say that has to happen. It's really only in the last 30 years that we start to see, the world go beyond male mice and male humans as the sort of standard for everything. And so that's good. We want this expansion. The problem is, if we do this and we expand our data set and pool, what I'm suggesting is you might not want to start by saying, let's divide the females and males right away and let's look at these patterns. What if we look at the variation, then ask the question is how do they divide out into these categories? That actually, when you look at the contemporary neurobiological dynamics functioning framework, it turns out you get different questions when you don't divide up the pool first.
Can you explain what kind of, how does it work in practice?
So it turns out there's more inter-individual variation in brains than there are variation explained by sex.
Yeah, but brain is notoriously difficult in this one, much less than like muscle mass.
So here, the muscle mass is really interesting. When you look at exercise physiology work and you look at sort of muscle mass comparisons, even when you add women into the pools, remember there's so much discrimination and bias against girls and women in training access and sports development. We still don't know what sort of the contemporary potential for female bodies are in the sense of muscle development, even in some elite sports.
Yeah, but hold on a second. I again see that there's a tension here, because making the comparison between brains and then muscle mass, I think that's going to invite the kind of intuition that, like male brains, female brains, very different, but there's some kind of overlap somehow. Whereas it seems to me pretty clear that the differences in body size, in bone density, muscle mass, whatever these things, we don't understand what exactly the differences are, but they are very obvious to anyone's eyes that there is something that happens that makes the average male look somewhat different than the average female, and something similar does not happen with the brain. Like, that's a genuinely interesting finding, and I just want to, I'm worried of like if everything becomes part of the same fluid dynamic, we lose these really important distinctions. That's what I wanted to pause here. What do you think?
No. I think that's really good. And in the book, I clearly talk about brains and I talk about muscles. I have a whole section on muscles and development where I'm like, look, here are some pattern variation, right? Some pattern differences in variation. I think they're very important. And so I identify sort of muscle strength and muscle density and muscle placement, right? Upper body versus lower body, and actually do review a bunch of the studies that compare those things. I hear these consistent patterns of difference that we find. And I think they're very interesting. I think there's a number of different explanations for why that happened. Some are radical difference associated with androgen and developmental trajectories. Others are performance and experience and sort of training. Others are things we don't understand yet. So I don't debate that at all. I think that's really important. But what that actually is, we don't know. So my argument about that training, like women are so underfunded globally in the sense of sports training relative to men, that we still don't know what is that diversity, what is that range of physical manifestations of female muscular development. Clearly, it's not the same 100% overlap with males. That's not the way our species works. But what is it? We don't yet know. And I think that's really interesting. So, for example, was it the 2 or 3 years ago in the World Cup, the Women's World Cup, the fastest goal kicked, right? The fastest speed on the ball was faster than the men's Premier League fastest ball, right? And so that I find very interesting. In elite art competitions, in certain contexts, we start to see those radical differences, which we see in general public things, being minimized. They don't disappear, but they get minimized. And that's where we get sort of some of these comparisons. The last thing I'll say on that is we should actually not talk about athletes at all, because most people are not elite athletes. And elite athletes, when we look at the distribution, like either males or females, they're this teeny, like 3% of all here, or less than that, 1%. And everyone gets the attention. For the vast majority of humans, a 1 second advantage in running 800 meters, it's irrelevant, right? And so I'm much more interested in not the athletes or not the elite athletes, but everyone. What are these patterns of muscle, of fat deposition, of circulating testosterone, estrogen, progesterone? What do they look like? And how do they vary? Because they do vary, but they vary in ways that are different, I think, than most people assume they do. And so understanding that pattern. And again, testosterone is a great example of a spectrum. Everyone's like, testosterone divides humans. No, all humans have testosterone. All humans produce testosterone. But what's really interesting is we have typical important differences that are massive in some cases.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. It's a spectrum of all these things with some extreme, right, differences in these areas.
I was reacting to the positively to when you said extreme, is because I actually personally went through the opposite movement on this testosterone front, which is that my naive gut impression was that testosterone levels might be something like height. That, yeah, on average more in males, but no.
No.
When I saw the graphs, I was like, oh my God, that's a big difference.
Yeah, on average. But what I find even more important is we don't spend enough time, and many researchers do, but we don't talk about it enough. You know what? There's 300% difference between males and testosterone, resting testosterone levels. That, I find that fascinating. So it relates to these sex differences. But if we're really interested in the science, we got to get away from thinking these are two different kinds of organisms and seeing how this organism, human, responds to these different levels of testosterone, these different kinds of dynamics.
No, that's a great way to put it. Before we finish, I need to say continue that pushback towards one thing which I personally find quite difficult around this conversation. We've touched already upon one of the key words in your, I think, very well but provocatively titled book, Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You. We touched upon monogamy. Another one is race. And we're not going to have a debate about whether race is biologically meaningful here. It's so obvious when you get into the nuts and bolts that it's just not. And I've spent a lot of time in my life trying to find very light ways to say this in conversation so that it sinks and they are like, oh my God, oh yeah, that's true. Something like the difference between East and West Africans is bigger than the difference between Chinese and Finnish or whatever. I've really tried and I keep trying, and I don't know if I've really found the art yet, but I will keep trying. Now, my concern is that it's very easy for people, even if you never say this, by the way, you never say this, but it's very easy for people to put this discussion we are having about sex and the discussion you would be having about race somewhere else into the same, there's a lot of this kind of complications, okay, but at the end of the day, with sex, it's there's this interesting interplay between the complex picture and then also the fact that there are these really meaningful approximations or categories which get pretty binary on some level of approximation. And with race, it's a completely different story.
Yeah.
And I'm really worried that this becomes a kind of backdoor, entry to race realists to be like, well, okay, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of something, but just like male and female, it's really useful if you want to understand how bees pollinate plants. In the same way, it's really important to understand white versus black people if you want to understand human biology. And how do you understand that concern, and what do you think of that concern? And this is a very much, you're not saying that this is the same thing. I'm just worried that that's how it gets read and heard.
Yeah, I mean, I argued very explicitly this is not, and that's why I don't bring it up in the book. And this is not, that's not the same thing at all. So race and sex are not compatible. They're not the same categories. They're not the same kinds of conversation. No matter what any of us do, race realists are going to argue for race realism. I mean, they're wrong. That's factually wrong, biologically wrong. There are no biological races in humans, period. The data are clear, but whatever we do. So, if they want to say, oh, well, then these same people, though, they're not going to admit that sex is not a binary. So I'm not actually that worried about it. They're going to lose their minds because they're also committed to a very, very specific sex binary. But here's what I agree with everything you just said. But because the reproductive categories of male and female are valuable, real, and consistently patterned in particular physiological ways across the animal kingdom, let's say, they're still not binaries. And this is what I want to get at. Understanding them as two parts of a system of a variation with typical developmental patterns and trajectories doesn't mean they're the same. It means they're different categories. It means there's a lot of critical difference in these patterns, but they're not separate things. They're not like a 1 and a 0. Right? That's a binary system. They're both numbers, but they're totally different. They are not the same. They do not even share, right, their essence, right, aside from being numbers, right? We're not like that. We are, in fact, developmental trajectories and categories. So male and female categories are totally real, totally important, not the same thing, but they're also not the same as a 1 and a 0. They're not separate things. And so my argument is, let's have a better conversation to talk about all this variation without masking difference. I think the way I lay it out, especially in the book, clearly those patterns of difference emerge. I review a ton of them, and I think those are really important, but it's not a binary 1-0. Males and females are not different kinds of thing. We're all the same species and humans, and there's a lot of cool complexity in there. And I think that approach, with the recognition of the contemporary biases and all of those kinds of things, I think is really important.
And on that note, it could be, I want to hear your take on this. My general impression is that the big kind of long arc of human evolution from our common ancestor with chimpanzees has quite a lot of reduced differences between male and females, right?
Yeah, from very early hominids, we have this reduced canine dimorphism, which is such a characteristic pattern in primates. And so it's very weird. So there's a characteristic reduction in clear dimorphic patterns in the hominin lineage. And that is really important, especially in the genus Homo. And you can't stress that enough. And that's why the comparative approach, like we can't talk about humans without talking about homins, without talking about apes, without talking about primates. not talking about mammals, not talking about birds and fish. I mean, that big comparative approach allows us to really understand what is distinctive about humans and what biological and evolutionary patterns can we sort of say, hey, we need to explain this.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to start coming to an end. So my final question to our guests is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, so I'm famous for being optimistic about humanity in spite of all the horrible things we've done. So my argument about creativity and imagination is that it has facilitated us to be the most amazing creature on the planet and the worst creature on the planet simultaneously. And so but I've tended to sort of see cooperation and this incredible evolutionary history of our genus as a sort of array of possibilities for where we go in the future. But I'm going to be completely honest. Right now, in the current moment, given everything going on in the world, I'm pretty pessimistic. And that's a drag. So all of my work has given me this toolkit to adapt, to respond, to sort of think about our evolutionary and biological histories as a deep set of possibilities. But I'm seeing the current cultural, historical moment narrowing those possibilities in some pretty bad ways. So I like to remain a kind of realist. So my realist evolutionary framing sees possibilities, but I'm much more of a pessimist about us being able to obtain them.
Professor Augustín Fuentes, thank you so much for your great work and time today.
And thank you so much for this amazing and just really enjoyable conversation.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. If you want more, check out the show notes. You'll find links to my Substack and Patreon and other episodes that connect to today's conversation. So you'll have plenty of ways to dig in deeper. I hope that you find something interesting there. And I hope that you tune in next time. Until then, take care.